Penguin Random House Audio presents A Tokyo Romance, a Memoir. This is the author, Ian Buruma. Cultural initiation entails metamorphosis, and we cannot learn any foreign values if we do not accept the risk of being transformed by what we learn. Simon Leys, The Hall of Uselessness. Chapter 1. The last thing he said to me before I closed the door of his smartly decorated loft apartment in Amsterdam was to stay away from Donald Ritchie's crowd. This was in the summer of 1975. I can't remember the name of the man who offered this advice, but I have a vague memory of what he looked like. Close-cropped grey hair, hawkish nose, an elegant cotton or linen jacket, mid-60s, I guessed. A designer, perhaps, or a retired advertising executive. He had lived in Japan for some years before retiring in Amsterdam. Donald Ritchie introduced Japanese cinema to the West. I knew that much about him. That he was also a novelist, the author of a famous book about travelling around the Japanese inland sea, much praised by Christopher Isherwood, and the director of short films that had become classics of the 1960s Japanese avant-garde, I didn't know. But I'd read 2 of his books on Japanese movies and was instantly drawn to the tone of his prose. Witty, in a wry, detached way, and polished without being arch or prissy. Reading Ritchie made me want to meet him. Always a perilous step for a fan that can easily end in sharp disillusion. There was not much biographical information on the covers of his books, but his 1971 introduction to Japanese cinema was written in New York, so I assumed that he was an American. In any case, I was still in Amsterdam, and Ritchie was, so far as I knew, in the United States, or possibly in Japan, where I was bound in a month or 2. For the first time in my life. My Pakistan International Airlines ticket had been booked. My place at the film department of Nihon University College of Art in Tokyo was secure, as was the Japanese government scholarship that would pay for my living expenses. The thought of moving to Tokyo for several years was intensely exciting, but alarming too. Would I be isolated and homesick and spend much of my time writing to people 6,000 miles away? Would I come back in a few months, humiliated by moral defeat? I had a Japanese girlfriend named Sumie, who had moved to Japan as well, but still. One of the most appealing features of Ritchie's books on Japanese cinema was the way he used the movies to describe so much else about Japanese life. You got a vivid idea of what people were like over there, how they behaved in love or in anger, their bittersweet resignation in the face of the unavoidable, their sense of humor, their sensitivity to the transience of things, the tension between personal desires and public obligations, and so on. Ritchie's fond picture of Japan through its movies was not particularly exotic. But then exoticism had never been Japan's main attraction to me anyway. Nor was I interested in traditional pursuits like Zen Buddhism or tea ceremonies, let alone the rigors of the martial arts. The imaginary characters in the movies described by Ritchie seemed recognizably human, more human indeed than characters in most American or even European films I'd seen. Or maybe it was the common humanity of figures in an unfamiliar setting that made it seem that way. Perhaps that's what excited me most about Japan, which was still no more than an idea, an image in my mind. The cultural strangeness mixed with that sense of raw humanity that I got from the movies, some of which I'd seen in art houses in Amsterdam and London or at the Paris Cinémathèque Française, and some of which I'd only read about in Donald Ritchie's books. I actually stumbled into Japan by accident. Asian culture had played no part in my childhood in Holland, even though The Hague, my hometown, still had a nostalgic whiff of the Orient, since people returning from the East Indian colonies used to retire there in large 19th century mansions near the sea, complaining of the cold and damp climate, missing the easy life, the clubs, the tropical landscapes, and the servants. I liked Indonesian food, one of the few reminders of the recent colonial past, and the peculiar Indo-Dutch variety of Chinese cuisine. Fat, oversized spring rolls, thick and oily fried noodles with a fiery Indonesian sambal sauce made of chilies and garlic, the delicacy of the original coarsened by the greed of Northern European appetites. My father's elder sister had the misfortune of being sent out to the Dutch East Indies as a nanny just before World War II. She ended up spending most of her time in a particularly grim Japanese POW camp. So no nostalgia there. Asia meant very little to me, but ever since I can remember, I dreamed of leaving the safe and slightly dull surroundings of my upper-middle-class childhood. A world of garden sprinklers, club ties, bridge parties, and the sound of tennis balls in summer. As a child, I was fascinated by the story of Aladdin, rubbing his magic lamp. It is possible that the mix of enchanted travels in faraway lands, he lived in an unspecified city in China, left a mark. The Hague was in any case not where I intended to end up. Perhaps I was prejudiced from an early age against my native country. My mother was British, born in London, the eldest daughter in a highly cultured Anglo-German Jewish family, which in my provincial eyes seemed immensely sophisticated. My uncle, John Schlesinger, whom I adored, was a well-known film director. He was also openly gay, and his milieu of actors, artists, and musicians added further spice to the air of refinement I soaked up vicariously. Like many artists, John was both self-absorbed and open to new sensations, anything that stirred his imagination. He wanted to be amused, surprised, stimulated. And so I was always eager to impress, giving a performance of one kind or another, mimicking mannerisms, styles of dress, or opinions that I thought might spark his interest. Of course, despite the posturing, I never felt I was being interesting enough, and recalling my efforts in retrospect is more than a little embarrassing. But in fact, performance came naturally to me. I grew up with two cultures, lapsed Dutch Protestant on my father's side, assimilated Anglo-Jewish on my mother's. I could pass in both, but never felt naturally at ease in either. My destiny was to be half in, half out, of almost anything. Passing was my default state. In the meantime, there was never any doubt in my mind that glamour was always somewhere else, in London, especially in my uncle's house when I was still living in Holland, but preferably somewhere farther afield where I didn't have to choose. By the time I was finally liberated from school and set out to live for a year in London, being into Asia had become a fashionable attitude. Hippie trips to India in a Volkswagen bus, a superficial acquaintance with Ravi Shankar's sitar music, the cloying smell of joss sticks and tea shops selling hash paraphernalia and Tibetan trinkets. I got to know some Indian hippies in England, who made the most of their mysterious Eastern provenance, and were far more successful with impressionable European women than I could ever have hoped to be. One of them, an Assamese Christian from Bangalore named Michael, was as much of a performer as I was, and he used his exotic allure to the fullest advantage. The first Japanese I ever met weren't even really Japanese. In 1971, instead of heading east in a Volkswagen bus before settling down to study at university, I travelled west to California. I was 19. I stayed at the house of a friend of my uncle's in Los Angeles, an alcoholic brain surgeon. His hands were steady during operations, I was told. He introduced me to an intense young man named Norman Yonimoto. Slim, tall, with large myopic eyes which bulged alarmingly when he got...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?